Your mobile phones switched off and all that kind of stuff, and then we'll work our way through the agenda. Apologies from Stuart and Patsy. And I know that, as I said, two members need to leave at 1 o'clock to get to another committee. So if you want to just move on to agenda item 2, go to page 5 through to 234 of your meeting packs. Kathleen Marshall, the Chair of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Exploitation in Northern Ireland, and Derek Williamson, the Inspector of the Criminal Justice Inspection in Northern Ireland, who is part of the inquiry team, will be attending the meeting to brief us through their report. So whenever they're ready, we'll invite them in. Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Whenever you're ready, if you want to brief us, we are hands-ordering this and it will appear on the committee website in due course, but whenever you're ready, if you want to brief us on your report, and then we'll open up the questions. So,
thank you very much.
Are you ready?
First of all, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity of presenting the findings of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Exploitation, and I very much welcome the fact that the committee has devoted the time to this issue, and I know you've got officials and the Minister coming next week, so I think that's a clear sign of your commitment. Could I invite Derek to introduce himself and his role in the inquiry?
My name is Derek Williamson from Criminal Justice Inspection. I led the criminal justice elements of the methodology for this review, and you'll know from the report that the methodology was focused very much on the front line of the issues for child sexual exploitation.
Yes, Derek was a member of the Inquiry Board, which comprised 6 people. The Regulation and Quality Improvement Authority were also represented, as well as the Education and Training Inspectorate, and the inquiry made full use of the resources of these 3 inspectorates. Individual members included Sheila Taylor, who is the Chief Executive of the National Working Group that specialises in child sexual exploitation, and Fiona Smith, Children and Young People's Advisor from the Royal College of Nursing. So we were very keen to make sure that we had a specific health focus as well as education, because this is a subject that crosses all sorts of boundaries. As members will be aware, the inquiry was commissioned by the Minister of Health, Social Services and Public Safety and the Minister of Justice in the wake of the revelations in September 2013 relating to the alleged abuse of 22 children and young people. Subsequently, the Minister for Education joined the inquiry. A strength of the inquiry has been that we've had a lot of cooperation and work, very practical input from these departments and the inspectorates. This inquiry was one of 3 responses to those revelations. There is also an ongoing PSNI investigation into the cases and a thematic review of the same 22 cases by the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland. This will involve a review of the files of the individual young people to identify whether there were failings. So in that respect, the thematic review is a bit more like the Rotherham approach of looking at case files, whereas this inquiry was taking a broader perspective on it. The terms of reference were to seek to establish the nature of child sexual exploitation in Northern Ireland and a measure of the extent to which it occurs, to examine the effectiveness of current cross-sectoral child safeguarding and protection arrangements and measures to prevent and tackle CSE, and to make recommendations on the future actions required to prevent and tackle it. The inquiry was specifically required to seek the views of children and young people and other key stakeholders, and to engage with parents to identify the issues they were facing and seek their views on what needed to be done to help keep their children safe from exploitation. And in total, the inquiry consulted 580 young people and 795 parents through a variety of consultation processes and face-to-face engagements. The inquiry's initial call for evidence attracted 50 submissions, some of which were followed up by individual meetings. We also proactively sought out persons and agencies that we believed could assist the inquiry. In terms of key messages as regards the nature of child sexual exploitation, the key messages were that child sexual exploitation is not new, as we all know, but that advances in communication technology have made it much more significant as a threat to a greater number of children and young people. People told us that there has been quite a change even in the past 2 to 5 years. The greater number of children and young people who are now vulnerable also includes disabled children and young people. Parents used to feel that they were better able to protect them when they were out and about, but now in the confines of their own bedrooms, they can be vulnerable when using social media, for example. So child sexual exploitation is a threat to all children and young people, not just to children in the care system. The forms that it takes in Northern Ireland are similar to those in other parts of the UK, but in each area of the UK, CSE is manifest at the hard level in a slightly different way, depending on the environment in which it is growing. In Northern Ireland, that has emerged in particular in relation to the legacy of the Troubles. In terms of the extent of child sexual exploitation, it isn't possible anywhere in the UK to give a precise assessment of the extent at the moment because the information is not held in a way that allows that. That was known when we started and is known now, and some of the recommendations are aimed at trying to make sure that that changes. Over the past year, awareness of child sexual exploitation has increased in Northern Ireland and the response to it has improved. There are excellent examples of dedicated work by a range of professionals and voluntary organisations, as well as the beginnings of improvement in data collection. Much more remains to be done, but there are some good foundations for that future work. Improvements in data collection and information sharing provide an essential foundation, but will have no impact unless accompanied by analysis and reflection. We concluded that that element was underdeveloped, although the work of Operation OWL in relation to the 22 cases provided an excellent example of good practice and something to build on. Themes from the recommendations are the need for awareness and cultural change, and we recommended a public health campaign. The message has to get through to everyone. From the justice perspective, this will be particularly important in informing those who come to serve on juries. We heard a lot about the difficulties that juries have in accepting the credibility of the allegations and of what young people tell them. The inquiry has recommended awareness raising aimed at attitudinal change for those who work within the justice system, but that's not practical for jurors who perform a critical role and who need to have their awareness raised beforehand. One of the big issues was that juries do not understand why young people go back to abusers or people who groomed them. We need a continued and reinforced commitment to improving relationships between police, young people and communities, and that's a message that came through very strongly. We know the commitment that PSNI has to that, but there is still an issue to be addressed there. We also need a continued and reinforced commitment to improving the response of the criminal justice system to reports of child abuse and child sexual exploitation. We need a strategic approach. Good things are happening around the region, but they're not joined up. We need a regional strategy that links in with and builds upon related strategies, such as those in trafficking, domestic violence, early intervention and drugs and alcohol. If you ask me what I wanted for young people as a result of all this work, I would say that we obviously need the structures and processes that promote justice and safety for them. But also, we need to inculcate in young people and their communities faith in the possibility of justice and in the possibility of safety, and faith in their own human dignity and value. I think that's all I have to say just now, Chair. So I'd thank you for the opportunity of making an opening statement, and we're very happy to receive questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I know two members need to run on, so if they wish to ask anything before they go.
Yes, Chair, I think, first of all, thank you very much for the report, but what I was interested in was really the commitment of the PSNI in relation to this, and how you saw this working through the system. I think it's very important that the PSNI be committed. I think you've acknowledged that, but to what extent does this manifest itself?
I think the commitment is clearly there at the strategic and policy level. The difficulty is making sure that that filters through to the level of work in the communities. And I came across this as well when I was here a few years ago doing a youth justice review where
Yes.
it was very, it was manifest, and the people I met, and I didn't doubt their commitment. But when you're out in the community and when you're talking to young people and to parents as well, and sometimes voluntary staff, there is the message isn't always getting translated into practice, and that's not to say that there isn't some excellent practice in some areas by some very dedicated officers, and I'd want to acknowledge that. But too often we hear stories of young people and parents who won't go to the police. Sometimes it's for community reasons, sometimes it's because they feel they won't get treated fairly, or they feel they won't get treated with respect, or they feel that nothing's going to happen as a result of it. So a lot has been achieved, but there's still an awful lot to be done in that area.
Are you saying it's not as comprehensive as it should be?
Yes, I think it's culture and attitude.
Yes.
And I think that applies both to the specific topics that we're talking about today, child sexual exploitation, where I think we notice the value. For example, we know there's been a huge investment in trafficking recently, and you've had the Act that's recently come into place, and there has been training on that. And certainly, I think Derek was doing interviews with frontline officers, and that had an impact. More officers knew about trafficking than knew about child sexual exploitation.
Yes.
And also in the education stream, the Education Inspectorate visited a number of schools and spoke to staff, pupils, etc. And there was more awareness of trafficking there as a result of the work that had been done. So in terms of the awareness of the subject itself, I think what's being done with trafficking presents a good example of what can be done with child sexual exploitation. I think there is another issue, though, which is about general relationships, perhaps more in some communities than in other, but I certainly found in the work I've done before as well that it seemed to be across the different communities about how people feel they're treated, young people and particularly at the front line. So I think there's those two strands, general relationships and the subject matter. I wonder if Derek
I think if I could add to that, just by way of some practical outworkings and examples. If you look at this in terms of how broadly as a society people understand and know CSE, then police officers to an extent are not much different than other people in society. On the one hand, while I absolutely agree that PSNI have more to do here and can do more in raising the awareness and the understanding, they're in no different a position. And I do think we need to be fair in the sense that we cannot expect operational frontline officers to be a child protection expert 20 minutes in this hour, and another 20 minutes in domestic violence, and another 20 minutes in mental health, and so on and so on. So I just think that puts slightly different perspective on it for me, and it's easy, if you like, to point the finger of blame and say that one organisation can solve this problem. It's a societal problem. It's an issue about awareness across all of society.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thanks. Sammy.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation so far. Kathleen, can I ask you, you had mentioned about some of the children kept on coming back to their abuser.
Yeah.
Is that a general, I assume that's not just a general problem in Northern Ireland, but...
Oh no, that's not, that's over the... That's very common. In fact, one of the problems with child sexual exploitation is that the young people often don't see themselves as victims, and it's part of the grooming process. Or sometimes once they've got into it, they're into it so deep, and then the threats come out, etc. And also, young people go back for different reasons. You know, there was one young person I spoke to who had been in the care system, and I quoted it in the report, who said that things were so chaotic in the unit that she was in that actually it was better being out with these people that she felt she got something from. So, and I don't want, in saying that, to say that all residential care is bad. There's some very good residential care as well, but it shows you that there are push factors and pull factors. And some young people have been brought up in environments where that kind of exploitative relationship is almost normalised, and they don't actually know any better. And that's what I meant about this having faith in their own human dignity and value, that basically they don't have that. You know, and they allow, I don't say they allow, that sounds as if I'm blaming them, but they get involved in relationships and they don't have anything better on offer that's going to encourage them to get out of it.
If you think about this also in the context that very many of the victims of child sexual exploitation, and particularly young girls, think of this as a normal relationship, which it absolutely is not, but they don't actually see themselves as victims, and therefore they do keep going back because they receive gifts and so on. And then, as Kathleen said earlier on, let's say if we got a case like that to court, then juries don't understand why they keep going back, and that was the point that Kathleen made earlier on.
Okay,
I
thanks.
think it's a mixture of attraction and threats. There's so many different configurations of these relationships. I wouldn't want to say they were all going back, because I get some of them it's a threatening relationship, or dependencies on drugs and things like that as well. So there's a variety of reasons why they go back.
Okay. I think one of the issues of young people not realising they're being exploited is a key issue, and in terms of being given alcohol or drugs or things like that, and asked for things in return. Do you think that the issue of underage drinking and young people being given alcohol is taken serious enough by the police, or is there enough police enforcement about that sort of stuff?
That came through as a big issue. That the general feeling is, basically a universal feeling was that it's very easy for young people to get into licensed premises, and that not very much is done about it. And young people talked about that too. One young person said, up to 13 you can go to underage discos. 13 to 15 there's nothing to do. Once you're 15 or 16 you get fake ID and you go to pubs and clubs, and that was just the kind of norm. So lots of people questioned why more wasn't being done about enforcing the licensing laws, and including this issue about taxi drivers, which I found strange, in terms of the context of the party houses, about taxi drivers responding to requests to buy alcohol and deliver it to houses. And then if they do that, if they don't get paid for it, they're the ones that are out of pocket. But sometimes that could be a party house with young people there, underage people. And I can't help feeling there must be something wrong about that. You're selling the alcohol. So the alcohol is a big issue, and that then, and the drugs impacts on young people's credibility, because they often won't know what's happened to them. They can't give the detail that will convince a jury about it, and that impacts on their credibility as well.
In response to Albin's question earlier, you said that a lot of young people were afraid to come forward or to go to the police. And I know in the report it talks about the involvement of powerful individuals and communities, perhaps linked to paramilitary organisations. How widespread is that? I mean, is it in particular areas across Northern Ireland, or is it more of a widespread problem that within paramilitary groups across the province?
We had some different views on that. Some people told us it was endemic, and other people made it clear that it was maybe a more serious problem in some communities than others, but also that it wasn't just in the cities, that there were villages and hamlets that were perhaps controlled by 3 or 4 powerful families that people felt they couldn't say no to. And again, there was a great sense within those communities that they were being left to it. And the phrases people said, one of the regular phrases that kept cropping up was, the dogs in the street know what's going on, but nobody's going to raise their head above the parapet and do anything about it. So that was, we had some quite emotional meetings with people from communities that were affected by that. And I do think that that's a real issue. And I know that these are certainly the perceptions of the communities involved, but we also got that it wasn't just from the communities. It was one of these subjects where, when we were going round, we met the trusts, and we met people from the looked after children, social workers, from management, and from the family support and intervention teams, and it was often raised there. And it was one of these subjects where, when we had events, people would come up to you at coffee break and say to us, "You've got to say this, because something has to be done about it," or they would write it on the flip chart that we'd put up for people to write messages on. So it wasn't just 1 or 2 people that said this. Nobody suggested, as I said, that it was a mission statement of paramilitary organisations, but it's about power and abuse of power, and that issue still hasn't been cracked in many areas.
And was there any suggestions or recommendations on how young people would feel more comfortable coming forward with information, or structures that could be set up to make it easier for them to do that?
You know, some of the people we talked to, I remember one person saying there had been a meeting about community safety and something, but that even the place where it was held was somewhere where the community representatives felt uncomfortable, and the format of the meeting. And there is this bit about, before you even get to talking, you've got to have an environment in which people feel comfortable. Yeah. And some of the people who spoke to us about it were very, adamant that we shouldn't name them. They said they're not going to give us names or locations, and that's why I made sure I wrote that in the report, because they were frightened. They were frightened of being identified. But I do think there are more things, like we talked about, police and community safety partnerships. There are structures that you've already got in place that should be being the bridges between communities and the police, and should be being able to raise these issues. And I know that Derek and the Inspectorate have done some work in that, but they don't seem to be capturing these issues and the issues that are of critical concern to people.
And just finally, before opening up, when the report talks about the different circumstances that exist now with the internet, and how young people can be approached the internet and may not necessarily know that the person that they're talking to is not of a similar age or who they say they are. And I know that the Minister had indicated he's bringing forward some legislation on sexting and things like that.
Yeah.
The report indicated that there's already quite a bit of legislation that's not being used effectively. And I noted that Sheila Taylor had said to the Health Committee that it's about getting better at using the legislation available to us. I do not believe that the legislation is not fit for purpose. I just think we didn't understand it enough to use it for the benefit of this area of work. Could you perhaps expand on that and maybe give us examples of where legislation could have been used better in cases around child sexual exploitation?
Well, I think a lot of people think the trafficking legislation should be used more. That's only appropriate for some cases, obviously, and I think there has been some movement on that. I was surprised that there wasn't more use of the provisions in the Children Northern Ireland Order about recovery orders, which have got more power to them than the Child Abduction Act and the Harbour's warning notices, etc. So I've kind of flagged that up. It just doesn't seem to be mentioned much. I found one reference in guidance, but it wasn't fleshed out. I think there's some confusion about the different orders that are available. I think Northern Ireland uses the sexual offence prevention orders more than some of the other jurisdictions do. And there's some issues about the risk of sexual harm orders. So there's a number of things that are going on, but I think a lot of it is more the practical stuff. The thing about the indecent images, for example, a lot of that is about capturing the information as well and interrogating it. And we found some inconsistencies in that. In some places, like we talked about one police district that had, seemed to have a very robust approach of taking the sort of called it pants and phones, in the street, and other places where it didn't seem to be happening. And we also know there's a big backlog in the forensic examination, and it's so critical for things like that. So there are a number of things that probably could be used better, and if they were better known. And again, I think Derek found different levels of understanding amongst the frontline police officers about what was available and what could be used. And
certainly a practical example of that again is the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, and officers were not fully aware of their powers under Section 19 in that Act. And there were other examples, but the other thing that I would want to add to what Kathleen has said is that, yes, absolutely, there could be greater understanding and greater use of the existing powers, but there are also some gaps around powers that are available, and we do highlight those in the report as well. Yeah. And I think that's part of the whole story around the legislation, rather than just focusing on what's not being used and is current on the statute book.
Okay. Raymond?
Thank you very much, Chair, and again, thank you very much for your presentation. And I mean, when you were speaking the first time, Derek, you mentioned that sort of idea of blame, and and it shouldn't be, but unfortunately, sometimes when there is that atmosphere of blame, people can perhaps become a bit defensive, or obviously. But it strikes me that, and I think in September 2013, the Minister held the summit. I think there was an hour meeting, and certainly the former chair and I were invited to it. But one of the things that struck me about all the people around the table, and they were very candid in fairness, but there was a sort of sense that people knew this was happening, but there was gaps.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm just wondering, and when you were speaking, Calling, you mentioned, you know, the word structures and processes. I'm just wondering, are we in a better place now in relation to structure and processes? And that sense of gap is I don't want to say it's not there, but certainly it's narrowed.
I think things have moved on a lot in the past year, actually. There's a lot more awareness, and things like the work of Operation OWL, I'll say that again, you know, because one of the things that I'm keen to find out is, you know, Operation OWL, people kept on talking to us about how valuable they found it, being across Northern Ireland and multi-agency, and it was helping with all of this gathering and analysis of information, etc. And it's been kind of subsumed back into the Public Protection Unit structure. And, you know, the idea is that these will learn the lessons of Operation OWL and build on that. But I think it's very important that that actually does happen, because when you get a situation like this, and a lot of things people are talking about what all the negatives are, when you get something that people are sort of universally positive about and it seems to work, then it's important that strength is carried through and built upon. So I think things have improved, but there's still a lot more to be done.
Because again, as part of the sort of briefing, then the officials came to the committee, and I was always struck that a senior member of the PSNI, you know, given his evidence, you know, obviously he was talking about the operations going forward, but no, I think Keane, I don't want to be speaking on his behalf, but there was that sort of sense that he knew that there had been gaps. But as far as he was concerned, he wanted to deal with it as it was, right? Which was, again, was very, you know, candid. And again, I'm just wondering, in reflection, you know, in all these reports and situations like that, were there signals that were missed that perhaps we should have spotted earlier? And what's the mechanism to ensure that they're spotted as we go forward?
You think that?
I think, would you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry, just to answer your question, Raymond, I think the structures certainly within PSNI at the time we produced this report were undergoing further change. And the positive in that was that, for me, it indicated a strategic intent on the part of the organisation to put more resources into that area. If there was a gap there, and it has already been acknowledged, I think, by PSNI, it was around the strategic analysis and the linking of cases which actually led to Operation OWL, and that was not consistent, and that was the learning from Operation OWL. It is also the learning that I hope will be applied going forward in the new structures. I'm pretty confident at this point in time, although the proof of the pudding is always in the eating, I'm pretty confident that the new structures have at least the capability to make the kind of links and join these cases together that would allow us to make the strategic assessments around where the risks are and where the resources need to be applied.
No, because again, and I've read the briefing to the Health Committee as well, your presentation to the Health Committee, but you know, there's that sort of layered thing where, you know, some people don't think they're being exploited. It's difficult, and you know, people give evidence to the committee again very openly and very frankly, and talked about, you know, it's difficult to keep someone in a care situation against their will, so they, you know, and then the conviction rate is low. So there's a combination of things that make it, maybe I'm not saying complacent because that would be an improper use of the word, but it's that sort of sense, you know, what can we do about it?
Yes.
And just, it's going forward, even, you know, if it's preventive or intervention, you know, that we have that in place to take us forward.
I think you're right in saying, you know, this is multi-layered, but at the very top end, I think this is actually about increasing confidence, and it's increasing confidence amongst victims that, and again, Kathleen referred to it at the very outset, increasing trust and confidence amongst victims that, you know, first of all, they know what it is they're looking at, and secondly, that there's a pathway to report it, and thirdly, that once it is reported, they have confidence that the system will respond appropriately to that. So, you know, if I was to leave one message, it would be building trust and confidence, and almost everything else flows from that.
And say, I mean, in a year's time from now, what would your measurement of that be?
I think that can only be measured by us going back to victims and talking to individual victims again. I mean, there could be other performance indicators for different agencies developed as a result. But again, as I said earlier on, the proof of the pudding's in the eating, and it's not unless and until we get victims who are telling us that they are confident in the system that we can achieve what we need to achieve.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I just add to that? One of the things about increasing confidence in the system for victims is actually listening to what young people have to say. And it's amazing how often they come out with perspectives that you wouldn't have thought of. I mean, there's a lot of good things that have been put in place, in terms of supporting vulnerable witnesses, etc. But you have to find out what that's experienced by the young people and what the barriers are for them. I mean, one young person I spoke to, he just kept saying it was scary. And when people talk to you, it was in a very formal way, and it made him feel as if this young person feels that the young person's fault, whereas the best information that this young person got was from a junior professional, who sat down and just explained things to him in a human way. And there are little things like that, that we need to. We've got structures in place, but to actually make them work for young people, it's getting their views on it. And that's really how to use resources best as well, because you can have all these things in place, and for some reason, that if you knew about it, you would do it, but you just don't know because the information doesn't come to you. So I think that getting the voice, the input of young people would be a big help to make the system work more smoothly and be more attractive for victims to approach.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Again, a very, very serious subject, and obviously the context of it all. But I read somewhere, I can't find it now, but I read somewhere over the weekend that there was a 10% conviction rate. Again, that's, in everybody's eyes, that's horrendous, but there's obviously, and we all realise there's reasons for that, very complex. There's a wide spectrum of crime even too, and scenarios and situations. But I was struck by something that you said, Kathleen, and that was about it's not just an inner city problem. It can be in our villages and our towns, and it could be around what would be perceived to be powerful families or individuals. And I think every one of us who's on the ground working as MLAs in some of our areas can see how that would develop and could be perceived to be the case. And there's always this sense, no matter what the crime, whether it's sexual exploitation or drug dealing or racketeering or paramilitarism, there is this burning sense that some people within community are untouchable. How often does that come up in your findings, and how do we ever break that perception down? And I suppose the obvious question is, I have to ask Derek, is it the perception? Or is it reality?
I say one of the things that one witness Pepperstone spoke to said that what needed to happen in their community was for some of the low-level crime as well to get tackled and to give them confidence, and just to make it clear that the police were there to protect them as well, and to kind of build up the confidence in it. I mean, there's some people talked about some very good examples, as I say, of community policing, and then they said that the community police officer would get taken off, like to work at the interface, and that would disrupt the relationship with the community, and especially when the young men and some of the flag protests and things like that, and they kind of that energised them in a pretty negative way, and so there were things like that perhaps the way the priority given to policing in the community and making sure that they are people who are really appropriate and committed, and that they're there for a long enough time, because sometimes people then get moved on and you get somebody else in and the whole relationship building bit starts again.
I think you asked whether or not this is perception, and I don't want to dismiss the fact that some people's perception is what you have described, because perception can be their lived reality, and so therefore it can't be dismissed, not by the PSNI, not by us, not I think by this committee or anyone else. But there are a number of things that I think that we can do to try and break that cycle, and we've referred earlier on to the role of police and community safety partnerships. And I think there's an information and a community confidence role and confidence building that they can play around this. Because PSNI, I don't speak for PSNI, but they told us very clearly in this piece of work, and they were very forthright about it in saying that there are no untouchables. There is no one who is above the law, and I accept that, but I put that to one side and say that that might be the reality for PSNI. The reality for communities is, as you have described, and the gap is the piece that needs to be worked on. Mm-hmm. It needs to be worked on by PSNI. It needs to be worked on also by police and community safety partnerships and others who can be controlled and corralled by the PCSP.
Can I just say what it reminds me of, this dynamic, is, I mean, I've done work in the past on historic abuse in children's homes in Scotland, and children who are now adults telling me that they thought everybody must know because life went on and they walked past, and that increased their the difficulties in them in telling everyone, because they thought everybody knew anyway and weren't doing anything about it. And it's a bit like that with the communities, and that's certainly, what we're hearing is that is their perception, and that is the reality that they're working from, and we can't really go in and say whether it's true or not, but that is their experience, and that's the basis on which they live their lives and decide to cooperate or report. And as the police said, they said, when you get to the senior levels of the police, they'll say, well, we can't act if we don't have the information. People have got to give us the information before we can do anything. But there's a real piece of work needs to be done there. But the issue about the untouchables, did come out quite strongly from the communities.
With regards to the credible statements and the credibility of witnesses / victims, there would be probably many scenarios whereby the victim could well have a criminal record by the fact that there was a connection with the perpetrator previously. Surely social services, along with PSNI, can be a factor, a positive factor in shoring up the credibility or the evidence of a victim. Does that not come out, or is that not bearing fruit or trueness in a court scenario? Does the jury not take that on board?
I think practice has been changing over. If you map this out over the last 5 to 10 years, the practice used to be very much that it was the credibility of the witness, which was the issue in any court proceedings. Now it's very much the case that it's the credibility of the allegation. And that starts with the investigation by PSNI in this jurisdiction. So, PSNI should not be looking as to whether a victim has a previous criminal record. They should be looking at the credibility of the allegation. And the evidence either supports and corroborates that allegation or it doesn't. And then the prosecution service should take, I know, the same approach, which is about the credibility of the allegation. Potentially where this breaks down is the issue we referred to earlier on, where juries perhaps may not understand this in the same way. As ordinary members of society, they don't. Many of them don't understand CSE and the issues around CSE, like returning to their abusers and so on. The fact that, if it's a drugs-related issue, that they may have a conviction for drugs possession or something like that. Juries don't readily assimilate that information and understand it in the same way, and I think that's where there's a gap.
Yes, I think this emphasis on the credibility of the allegation is one of these recent things, and it has strengthened over the past year because, there have been, and PSNI said that themselves, that they have in the past tended to focus on the credibility of the victim and relying on the evidence of the victim. And in a subject like child sexual exploitation, you're often not going to get the cooperation of the victim, so you have to try and work around that. And I think that has been one of the changes for the better in the past year. I think there's also an issue of how much information the police files, that go to the PPS, and how full the information on that is and what it's informed by, to kind of try and set the context. And I think there were some comments about that, about sometimes the files that go from the police to the PPS are not full enough even to give the PPS a full picture of the context in which that arose. And again, I think moving in the helpful wake of all the trafficking work that's been done here, and the emphasis there on not blaming the victim, and an understanding that people who've been trafficked can often become involved in criminal activity, and it's sometimes deliberately done to actually make it difficult for them to approach the statutory authorities. So I'm hoping some of that learning, people will also understand that dynamic is also at work in child sexual exploitation. Because young people have said that as well. You might want to go to the police because you've done something, or one of them said you might have told them something that wasn't true in the past and they're not going to believe you now, So there are all of these things that are going on, and the fact that young people in care particularly often accumulate charges and convictions for things that no other young person would ever get involved in. They get ridiculous bail conditions about, abiding by the rules of the children's home or something like that. So young people in care can very easily build up a number of convictions that makes their credibility lesser in the eyes of juries as well. So there's a whole concatenation of things feeding that.
I need to be careful here, because obviously it's an experience as an elected representative, and there will not be that many in any constituency, but there's bound to be evidence of perpetrators targeting care homes in a locality and enticing young people out, sharing with gifts. How big an issue is that, or is it here or there sporadic, or is it really an orchestrated, organised gang?
There are levels of organisation, and what we heard generally was that mostly in Northern Ireland at the moment it wasn't organised gangs as such, but associations which some of it was organised. They would coalesce around a young person and home in on their vulnerability. That's not to say there aren't gangs. I believe there are gangs as well, but I don't think that's the primary model in Northern Ireland. I think gangs, particularly around the drugs, and drugs are very closely associated with it, and prostitution and trafficking. So at different levels, there are different levels of organisation, different forms of CSE. I think certainly what the trust, the social care staff told us, was that in the past it was more evident that people were targeting young people in homes and turning up taxis, turning up or cars, etc. And they thought that had decreased. But of course, another side to that is that people are getting cleverer at it. The fact that the taxi isn't at the door of the children's home or the car doesn't mean to say it's not round the corner. So it's one of these moving targets, and I think that's one of the, when we're talking about child sexual exploitation here, you say it's going to keep changing. And as soon as we plug one gap, people are going to find a way for another. And so it's not just, you can't just put guidance in place and training in place and that's it, you've done it. It's got to be constantly refreshed by what's happening. And that, again, is where you're going to need a link to young people who are able to tell you what kinds of things are happening.
So how do we actually get down and educate our young people to the dangers and the awareness of this evil crime? And how do we get through to the people, and there are many people who will simply say, this is my lot, this is the way my life is, this is the way my mother's life was, this is my sister's life was, my cousin's life. This is it. There's nothing better for me. And if I do make a nuisance of myself, then it will become unknown and things may become worse. How do we get down? It's
very, very, very difficult, and I think it's giving young people hope that things could be better. And to say some young people's lives that's going to be very difficult. And as I say, we also heard from older people who had been exploited as children, and women saying that they found it difficult to support their children because they hadn't got over what had happened to them. And there's a sense in which too you have to deal with it at the different generational levels so they can support their children too, to say that there's something better. I do think that the awareness raising thing is important, but there has to be stuff that follows on from it. And one of the recommendations that there hasn't been any discussion on at all, as far as I'm aware, but I think is critical, is about reviewing youth services. Because there already are resources in Northern Ireland. I mean, I know you can't just say we're going to put millions and millions into new. There are resources, but a lot of people, including youth workers themselves, have said that they're actually not attractive to young people, generally speaking, and that they need to be reviewed. Young people need to have things to do. They've got all these enticing things that are going on in pubs and clubs, and the thing is there is a fun element in it, I mean, we talk about it in terms of child sexual exploitation, but to them it's entertainment and it's fun. And some of the young people we spoke to were quite clear about that. We go to parties, and yes, there's drugs and alcohol, but it's just good times. Don't have to do anything in exchange. They don't see their own vulnerability about what might happen next. But we really do have to create environments in which there are attractive things for young people to do, and where they can value, identify and nurture and value the talents that they have, and make them realise that they actually are worth something. I mean, that's only one strand. It's obviously a multifaceted thing. And I think schools, the very strong message came out about the role of schools in this, and the work that the Education and Training Inspectorate did, going through all the schools, including some special schools, and talking to people in cluster groups was very illuminating. Schools are very willing to be involved in that as well, and they're in a good position to identify young people and identify their talents and nurture them. But it really is that giving them hope, a sense of dignity and value. And for those who are deeply mired in it, it's trying to give them faith in the idea that there may be some escape. And that's why we talked about having safe spaces for children. Children will tell young people, they'll tell you different things about what, it's not necessarily that you've got one place that's a refuge for all young people who have had child sexual exploitation. What a space, what they need to feel safe could differ from one young person to another. I mean, one young person who spoke to us said when she was insecure, for example, she was able to receive phone calls. A member of staff sat in the room, and she said, but they should have a loudspeaker, because she couldn't hear what was being said at the other end. Yeah. Now, that was one of the things that would have made her feel safe. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I've spoken in the past to young people, I remember this was in Scotland, in a children's unit who had abusive parents, and there were two girls talking there about foster care and residential care. And what they were saying was, well, residential care is much better, because when you're foster care, you've just got these two skinny wee foster carers, and your parents can track you down and push them away and get you. Whereas in the unit, there's staff, and some of them are quite big. And that sheer physical thing made them feel safe in the unit. And there are other things, like you can have premises that are secure from the outside in, but not from the inside out. So it's actually talking to young people, and it's not necessarily one thing for all young people about what is it that is going to make you feel safe, what do you need to support us. And I think if they have faith in the fact that they can be safe, they're more likely to go along with it and to comply with it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sean?
Thank you, Chair, and I apologise for not being in at the time. And I just glanced over it, and there seems to be a lot in it and a lot of issues. I just want to ask one question. Did you look at the role of social media in CSEs?
Yeah. Yes, social media is a huge issue. And again, it's constantly changing. Like people think there's something on Facebook or something, and then they'll move on to another. The social media is constantly evolving, and young people are miles ahead of us with it. And that's where the issue of sexting came up in particular, this encouragement to send indecent images of yourself, and often in the understanding that it's going to disappear. It's only got 10 seconds or something like that, but there are ways of capturing the screen. And so young people do this, and then they get it gets passed around and they can get blackmailed about it or bullied. And the social media as well, because it's so accessible, a lot of disabled young people in particular rely on social media for their social life, you know, and they're very vulnerable. And you've had examples of that, you know, where someone will be pretending to be their age and say, you know, you're beautiful and all that, and can you just do this and just do that? And they're in their own bedrooms and the parents don't know. So there's a big issue. But I mean, social media is a very positive thing as well, and both young people and parents made that point. It's very positive. But I think that's one of the awareness raising things from the very beginning. Some of the young people I spoke to were saying, you know, why didn't we know this? I mean, there is online, they do get education at school on online exploitation, and a lot of young people mentioned that, but it has to be able to keep up to date with what's happening and what the current threat is.
Thanks, Chair.
Tom?
Chair, thank you. And again, apologies for missing start of the presentation. I noticed that the report focuses quite a lot on looked after children that maybe would be expected to be vulnerable, or that we would expect to be vulnerable in society. What about as we would class, the more stable homes and the more stable family homes? Do you see even a significant exploitation of some of those children as well? Whether that's, I'd like to hear if there's even some of that takes place in the home, or are those children being exploited by the parties, the house parties and the other groups that they can get involved in today's society?
I think that is one of the growing phenomena, and we had sort of a universal response to that from the voluntary organisations and social care and the schools. A lot of the education organisations that were consulted, you know, the counselling services, education welfare service, etc., were all identifying a growing number of young people from what you would call, you know, ordinary stable families who were being caught up in this. Again, it's very difficult to estimate the extent of that because young people aren't likely to say what's happening to them. And the fact, though, that awareness is being increased amongst young people, amongst education staff and social care staff, we hope that this will begin to... I mean, it might look frightening at the beginning as the numbers increase, but actually it's what's happening already. Certainly the CEOP information is that a lot of the indecent images, for example, the backdrop is a young person's bedroom. You know, that they're sending these things from their home. And so it's a peer group, peer pressure thing, and it's the thing to do. But once you start, as I say, I did have some engagements with young people at the beginning, groups, and they were saying, you know, we should know about this, and our parents should know about this. And parents were very eager to learn as well, and schools are very eager to share the information.
Yeah, that's a double-edged sword, though. When the parents know and you tell the children, then obviously it can have two effects. It can actually be positive in that it stops them from being exploited, or secondly, then there's always a temptation to try it out and to try and get engaged in some other groups that may not be appropriate. So I totally accept that the issues around that, but it is a double-edged sword. I'm assuming the social media has increased the amount of sexual exploitation among what we would term as more stable family homes.
Yes, because it's undoubtedly, and I say it's just so easy for people to access young people, and party houses as well. You know, party venues are advertised on social media, so that, I mean, it's not just word of mouth anymore. They'll know something is going on, and they'll go to it. So it's just so easy for people to contact young people and for young people to get caught up in this.
I mean, you're right in saying that a good part of this report talks about looked after children, but we're also very clear in saying that ordinary stable family homes are as much a vulnerable place than a looked after children's home. And actually we did some research around one of the vulnerability issues is going missing for looked after children. And we did some research around that, and we found that on one weekend there were almost twice as many missing from ordinary stable homes as there were from children's homes. So that, in a sense, gives you a sense of the scale, and it will be no different in terms of social media, I think. So, you know, to focus entirely on looked after children actually would be wrong. The vulnerability of all children should be something that we are concerned about.
Okay. Thanks, Jim.
Just to finish off, and we've got tight in time, you'd mentioned about the arrangements that statutory and voluntary organisations can share information about those who may be a threat, and obviously there was the recent judicial review and there's some confusion around that. What are the issues that are there, and what are the concerns about the ability to share information? I think that would be important to...
I think it's more important for Northern Ireland than for other jurisdictions, because in Northern Ireland, a lot of the people who have been sexual offenders in the past, and maybe even in the present, have been dealt with, you know, illegally by the paramilitary beatings, and they're not on record, you know. So you do have people floating around that people have known have abused children in the past, and it is important that, you know, that we get a very balanced view of the human rights here. And I know that the DHS SPS are working on new guidance. Sometimes people get a view that human rights are adult rights and are somehow in conflict with children's rights. But like the European Court of Human Rights has also been very clear that children's rights to protection are a very legitimate consideration. It's a question of making sure you have a proportionate response. Yeah. Certainly from what we found in the wake of the judicial review, there was a lot of uncertainty amongst practitioners about what information they could share. And although some guidance had come out interim to say this circular 396 still stands, such and such, people still felt very hesitant. And it may be that some things had gone too far. I think there was a suggestion that the information was being shared too widely about general risks rather than focusing on protecting our children. So it is being looked at, but I do hope that children's rights to protection is put into the balance as a very proportionate thing, and that very clear guidance is given. You know, one of the pieces of information that went out was it said it's still extant and links to court judgments, but practitioners don't have the time or the expertise to look at court judgments. They need that to be interpreted for them, and the management need to take the responsibility for saying this is what should happen. There's obviously some professional discretion, but I think we need a lot more clarity on that and a robust process that takes full account of the weight that needs to be given to the protection of children.
Okay, thank you very much. Look, Kathleen, Derek, thank you very much for your time. Very valuable, and appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Members, just to remind everyone that the Minister's in front of the committee on the 4th of February and will give his response to the findings and recommendations in the report, so just bear that in mind. Just before we finish, correspondence, an invitation has been received for a NACRO seminar. Sammy Douglas is sponsoring that. Our Voice, developing a charter and policy framework for children affected by imprisonment of a family member. It takes place tomorrow in the members' dining room between 12:30 and 1:30. And lunch is provided, which always makes these things more attractive. Yeah. So if anybody wants to go, if you just let the clerk know, or just go along.
Chair, I think I replied, don't book me in for lunch, but I might call in for a short period because I have another engagement.
That's okay.
Yeah, I believe I've already responded, but...
That's okay. Any other business? Not really anything. Just, I was made aware of one issue earlier on about the ad hoc committee. Remember a couple of weeks ago, the Attorney General was tabling the statutory rule around the PSNI stuff. Some of the party whips are now putting people onto the ad hoc committee. Now I know that two of the parties had put members who are also on the Justice Committee. There's nothing to prevent them from doing it, but I would have thought it's probably good practice if we don't duplicate membership of the Justice Committee along with the ad hoc committee, given that we're the scrutiny body and the ad hoc committee.
Put that right into our chief whip, could you?
I think your chief whip might have been one of them. So I know I mentioned it to Alban. I think he was in agreement that perhaps it wouldn't be appropriate for him to be on the ad hoc committee. But if you just want to mention it to your whips, and because I know they're trying to get that done today, and procedures are meeting at 1 o'clock to formalise that ad hoc committee. So if you just maybe mention it to your whips. Okay. If there's no other business, then the next meeting is tomorrow, 2 p.m. room 21.